right, so we're going to jump right into it. We have a short hour and we have a lot to jam pack in there. So I'm going to jump right into some intros and some housekeeping items and so on and so forth. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Flipping the Script on Traditional News Media panel, where you'll be meeting the changemakers who are doing the work. My name is Christina Noble. I'm the project manager for Stories of Atlantic City. We also have Toby Rosenthal on the call, who is our project coordinator, as well as Aaron O'Hanlon, who is one of our partners. I'll be facilitating today's conversation. I'm going to keep my introduction brief because, again, we have so much to jam pack into today's agenda. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Please be sure to stay muted throughout the call. We will have a short Q&A segment at the end of this event, in which we'll ask you to unmute and ask your questions at that time. However, in the meantime, please feel free to type questions that you have in the chat. We'll be sure to address them at the end. Also, this meeting is being recorded. So although we encourage you to be on screen, we love to see your faces. We understand if you're unable to do so. So let's jump right into some introductions. So we have Vanessa Maria Graber, who's one of our panelists today, who is a community organizer, educator, and multimedia producer focusing on media justice. She currently is the News Voices Director at Free Press, which is a national media and technology advocacy organization that was created to give people a voice in the crucial decisions that shape our media. Vanessa also co-produces Free Press's weekly public affairs program entitled Free Press Live, and is a member of the Puerto Rico telecommunications policy team. In New Jersey, she's the lead facilitator of a collaborative and community-centered local news organization, and is a member of the planning team for the New Jersey News and Information Statewide Coalition. Currently, she serves on the board of directors of the Philadelphia chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and is an adjunct professor at Stockton University in the communications department. And in her background, she also co-founded PhillyCam's community radio station. Next, we have Brit Harley, who is the founder of Five Words Media and the co-founder of the Newark News and Story Collaborative. Five Words Media centers the concerns, voices, and information needs of the diverse communities in Newark by producing unique coverage of neighborhoods across the city and training residents to tell their own stories. And the Newark News and Story Collaborative focuses on elevating untold and underreported stories in Newark with an approach that is centered in listening to residents, building deep relationships with them, and producing community-centered journalism. Brit is also a senior John S. Knight Community Impact Fellow and Community Engagement Reporter. And last but certainly not least, we have Christopher Flood the drummer, Norris, who is a professional drummer, a journalist, and a broadcaster currently serving as WHYY's managing editor for community engagement. Chris produces and hosts community conversations for digital and broadcast. And prior to joining WHYY in November 2019, Chris was the CEO of TechBook Online, which was a grassroots digital publishing company. And he's also a political commentator for various local radio stations, including WDAS FM 105.3. So as you can see, we have a very dynamic group. So excited to have you all today to join us for this panel. So we'll be talking about community-powered journalism today, and simplistically, community-powered media engages and centers the community in which it serves. It also aids in the process of building citizenship and raising social awareness. Accessibility and participation, are key to this work. And community-powered news media can take many different forms, as you've heard. It can be print, it can be digital, it can be broadcast, and so much more. So let's jump right into our conversation. So again, you all are such a dynamic group of people. You come from such unique backgrounds, both personally and professionally. So I'm going to give you an opportunity in 1 to 2 minutes each, just to tell us a little bit about how you got into this work and what your background is. And we can start with Vanessa.
Hello, hola, bienvenidos. Thank you for having me on the panel. It's super great to be here talking about my favorite subject. I actually got involved in media as a teen. I hosted the TV news at my high school, CDTV, and got involved in like youth media summer programs. So for that reason, I think it's so important to have youth media programs and college radio and television. I went on to be a college radio DJ. And then one of my first jobs in radio was working for AM news station as a local news reporter who was covering city, county government and school boards. And I learned a lot about rural Western Pennsylvania and the importance of this civic information. But I also realized that I was the only Latina, probably in like the whole county working in media. So, and I also recognized that there was very little Spanish language media. I went on to live in North Carolina and work for several stations there. And I got involved in a community radio station called WCOM. And I was a producer and instructor for a youth radio program called Radio Palante. And at the same time, I was working for another AM news station, and I could really see how different the two stations operated. At the AM station, I worked by myself. I went out on assignment. I didn't really talk to a lot of people. It was very lonely. At the community radio station, not only was it a studio, but it was a hub for the community. Lots of people gathered. They had Spanish language programming, other Latinos, and it was very inclusive, and you had a lot more freedom to create your own content and tell your own story. And I think that's like the moment when I jumped on the community radio bandwagon. So later on, I joined the Prometheus Radio Project, which is a nonprofit organization where we work to pass the Local Community Radio Act. And that was an effort to expand community radio in the United States by opening up more frequencies. And the reason we needed that is because of the deep impacts that media consolidation and corporate media ownership had on the loss of local journalism and the exclusion of Black and Brown people from the media. And to begin to understand the institutional and like systemic racism that was operating in media spaces, and kind of went from being a journalist and a radio producer to being an advocate, which is what I still do today with Free Press. Before I joined Free Press, I co-founded WPPM, a community radio station in Philly, where again, we developed the only youth radio program on the FM. We had 6 Spanish language programs. We had people from indigenous communities doing the only indigenous radio. We also have people from reentry doing radio stories. So we really tried to fill in the gaps left by mainstream media, especially in a city like Philly, where there's lots of media, it's ubiquitous, but still many people did not have access. And now I work for Free Press as an advocate, trying to expand local journalism, trying to work with newsrooms to become more community-centered, to make their languages more accessible to other communities. And I also now am teaching at Stockton, right? Like in an effort to change the way we think about journalism with young people and the next generation of journalists. But all of that is rooted in my love for community and my desire to make a media that's more reflective of the people in the community it's supposed to serve. And also in the belief that communication and access to information is a human right.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. We're going to jump right to Brit. And again, the question is, how did you get into this work?
Sure, thanks so much. How did I get into this work? Well, I come to this work just doing youth and community work prior to joining the news team at WBGO, Newark Public Radio, and making that pivot into media. I worked in over 10 schools here in Newark, New Jersey, in the school district. I partnered with young people to create different types of projects, whether it's to impact school culture or community culture, whatever issues or passions that they wanted to create community around or engage their teachers, staff, peers. That's a lot of the work that kind of springboarded and set up the platform to pivot into media. My community work also consisted of doing community feedings with my peers. We did a lot of organizing and also youth work training other young people to organize around specific projects in their community. And we would partner with community organizations, community centers to do a lot of that programming. And so I'm not a traditionally trained journalist. The community is where I got a lot of my championships belts that I brought to the newsroom, and now launching 5 Wards Media.
Thank you, Brit. Chris?
Sure. Good afternoon. I feel like my earliest start in media, I think about 6 or 7, right? And the earliest memory is taking a styrofoam cup and cutting the hole out of the bottom and pretending that it was a video camera and walking up to strangers on the block and interviewing them. And it was such a habitual practice for me that my mother eventually bought me a Tyco RC home video camera where I would make movies and pretend that I was producing an actual wrestling show with my toys. And then I started doing the camera and media at church, part of the media ministry. In high school, like Vanessa, I was the news anchor. And then I kind of stepped away from that and really indulged in my professional music and professional sales background, lived in Texas for a bit. And it was coming back to Philly in 2009 and seeing kind of like when you kind of step out of your circumstances and step back in, you kind of have a different set of eyes. And so I kind of was like looking around, and I realized there was so many problems in the community that I had lived in. And that part of the problem was that people didn't know how to take those next steps to solving them. And they didn't have the information and context to be able to do that. And so in 2009, I started TechBook Online and ran that company for 10 years until I departed in November to join WHYY. But when I started TechBook, the initial goal was to get into the college online textbook market, because I was living in Austin. They had, an open RFP for downloadable textbooks, and we wanted to get into that market. And it was the Occupy Philly of October 2011. When that kind of happened, I went down there with a very small Kodak ZI-8 camera and just started doing, talking to people and putting those videos online. And eventually those videos got picked up by Comcast. They had launched a project called Project Open Voice in 2014. And so we started publishing for Philly in Focus. A year and a half later, we became their largest and most active publisher. 2014, I became a contributor to WURD. 2015, became a contributor to Philly Magazine. And in 2016 and 2017, started working with the Philadelphia Inquirer as a columnist, opinion contributor. And then in 2018, 2019, started working with WDAS. And so all of that kind of like led me into where I am now. And the through line was that I was covering police, politics, and protests. That's kind of where I saw my, where I positioned myself to do. And it brought, I think, a lot of value to a lot of the organizations, because they didn't really have any journalists rooted in social justice. And I don't think the editorial team really cared about social justice or trying to understand it. And so now, at WHYY going on 3 years, I don't get out and cover much anymore, but I do a lot of the community conversations where I'm able to still maintain that presence in police, politics, and protests.
Thanks so much, Chris. Such diverse backgrounds. And I love that a lot of you didn't actually start at J School. You started in the community. That really helped to build where you are today. So I love that. So we know, for all of you who are so active in the community, that mistrust and distrust is a major thing when it comes to these marginalized communities, considering media's history, right? So how do you all infiltrate that? And what are some practical relationship building techniques that you could offer our fellows on the call, as well as our community members who may be interested in reporting at some point? What can they do at this moment to really start to build trust with the community so that, sharing this information at a later date will be effective?
I'll jump and just say quickly, showing up is probably the biggest thing. I mean, when I started, my organization, to your point, I didn't have a J School degree. I barely had a press pass to get into City Hall. But I also felt like City Hall had enough journalists covering it, right? And that my community didn't. And so I showed up to the support groups for moms who lost their kids. I showed up to the protests. I showed up to where I took the road less traveled. And I didn't always show up with my camera and tripod and notes. Sometimes you just show up. right? So people can see you there and not show up with an agenda, not show up with a story. I think part of the problem with media that people feel is that it is transactional, and that you actually only come to the community to get the soundbite because you've already written and framed your story. You just need a quote now. And what I did was just sit and said, you know, how can I be of service? What are the stories that are not being told? And so I think the very practical thing to do is show up and listen, and everything else will follow.
Thank you so much for that. You're really speaking about that relationship building with the community, as opposed to the parachute journalists who come in, they write the story, and then they leave without having any real context about the community. So I love that, just building that relationship and not always having a camera, which is essential. You really need to build those relationships in order to gain that trust. So thank you for that insight. Vanessa or Brit, you want to jump in?
Well, fun fact, I met Chris on the streets of protests, and it became pretty evident at times that Chris and I were the only quote unquote media at some of these protests. And, you know, protests, like people have a very like interesting way of like looking at protests, right? Like I feel like the general public doesn't like truly know what it means to like hold public space and gather and share ideas. They think of it more as like, this is an action, right? Like, and a lot of times it's not that, you know, it's hearing the stories of the people impacted by a lot of these policies, right? And so if nothing else, you go to hear those stories. Like, yeah, maybe there's only like 20 people at this protest and it's freezing out and it's not, there's not media coverage on it. But you might meet people who, you know, have a very impactful story and they want to work with you to get that out. And it affords you, it's actually good when no other journalists show, because then you can actually talk to people and get to know them and figure out like the deeper meaning behind these policies that people are resisting. And so we spent many times just talking to people, like, you know, maybe we'll write a blog about it, maybe we'll do a story about it, but like, we really are just hanging out and spending time with people. And when you show up enough, right, like even when nobody is around, like they start to notice like, oh, look, it's these two again, right? And there's one other guy, Joe Piet, who like photographs everything. He's always there. And so when there's not that many of you, people start to take notice, right? Like before they've even talked to you, they just start to, oh, you're that person, you're always here. And then they might approach you and ask you like what you're doing. And hopefully you've been listening. And so you can start to say, well, this is what I've observed in all these cases. So, you know, that's just one thing about the realities of like how journalists interact with social movements, which has also been an area that has been a big part of my journalism. But I think like, again, like putting journalism aside and like just looking at how we hold multiple identities. Like I was born and raised in Philadelphia, right? And then, you know, I've spent the last 10 years like living off and on in New Jersey. Like I'm a community member and like I care what happens to my neighbors. I care what's happening in the parks. I care what's happening in the public schools. I care what's happening with youth. And like, what are the ways that I'm showing my care about these issues and like showing up for my neighbors, right? Like, I think journalists need to like first think about how they are like good citizens and good neighbors, right? Before they can think about how they're like good journalists, right? Because like, if you're not a good neighbor, you don't actually care about what's happening in the community, like any effort you make to try to form relationships can be really fake. And people know that, right? So I think like you have to look deep within yourself and think like, why do I care? Like what are the ways I'm of service to my community, right? Again, like, do you volunteer? Do you donate? Do you try to learn and like, you know, engage in personal self-development to better understand these issues and how it affects everybody? Like that work comes before you even write a story or like approach anybody. And that's like lifelong. That has to be like deep within you, right? Just in general. So I just want to state that, right? And then if you are a good citizen and a good neighbor and you care and you've done some education and reflection, then when you try to reach out, it comes from a more authentic place, right? And that's part of the reaching out, is like you're explaining to people, your sources, like where you're coming from. And like, I actually do come with an agenda. Even if I'm not writing a story, I'm coming with an agenda, right? Like, I want to make the world a better place. I want to stop this systemic oppression. I want to reduce harm. And like, what are the ways I can do that? Can my journalism do that? Maybe, I hope so. But are there other ways that we can work together on that? And that's when you begin to like build bridges, right? Because the reality is, if you work in a newsroom, a lot of times you're not afforded the freedom to write the story and like use your journalism as the tool to like help people. And you have to work around them and find like other ways to like collaborate and work together. And I can say that that's true. Like, I've worked with lots of people in other areas, and then it's come back to journalism and a story and a show and content, right? Like, but sometimes like the road to get there is a little bit windy. And like I said, it's just being transparent about what your true like motivation is as a human, not even just as a journalist, but like, why do you want to engage and why do you want to tell these stories? Is it rooted in some sort of altruism, or are you just interested in some egotistical reason, or for most commercial media, like making a profit?
Thank you. So many crucial points that you hit. I love the idea of being a good citizen and a good neighbor first. You really do have to have that passion for your community, that sense of connection as well, which I think is so important for journalists to be a part of the communities that they're reporting on. You know your community best. So again, such great points. Brittany, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just veggie back really quickly. Chris and Vanessa said it all. And I'll just say that it's okay to invite folks out to coffee, tea. I know we're in a COVID world. It can happen virtually or socially distant, to just get to know them. That's okay. The outcome in the end or down the line could potentially be a story or content, or it can just be someone in the community that you can call, that can call you, that can let you know about other things that may be going on. Just again, what is your commitment to that community and being a part of that community? How are you engaging with also the people that you know, but also the people that you don't know? When I pivoted into radio, I use it as an opportunity to think about like folks I've been wanting to connect with and not able to do it, and also asking those people, were there other folks that I should be connecting with and talking to about these things? And so it's okay to just tell folks like what you're up to, or hosting something and say like, I just want to listen and know what's up. But really, conversation is happening in all of these other places. There are folks already that have solutions or ways that they're sharing information, or just being in community with one another. So when you just reach out to just say like, what's up, what's good, let's kick it. I'm just interested and committed to what you all have going on. And I want to be a part of that. That ultimately is like a huge part of the trust building too. Because the agenda could be like, I just want to be in community with y'all, to really understand what you need, what are the needs. And if you are a part of that community, you have needs, right? And so you get the full spectrum beyond just like your needs. You also get aligned with other folks. And that's also an opportunity to also build power.
If I can just really quickly, Christina, to Brit's point, I think that attitude is what can help bring in a paradigm shift, because I have done that with people I have seen on Instagram who I mean, young man comes to mind right now in Philly, John Solomon, you know, who's just kind of like out in the most dangerous parts of the city talking with shooters, right? Because he was a shooter and he's only like 27. He came back from prison and saw like, this is what I want to do. And I hit him up and did a couple media spots for him. But I said, listen, I just want to take you to lunch and get to know you. I said, and I just would love to be able to be a resource to you. Just let me know what you need. And I tend to do that often. And the reaction to the people is interesting as you're trying to build trust. When you show up that much more authentic, at first there's cynicism, because it's like, no one's that nice, right? No one's that genuine. There's gotta be an agenda. And it's like, no, I do have an agenda. I want to know you, you know, like I want to be in your world and your sphere of influence. And then if something happens, if we wound up doing a collaboration, doing a show or something together, that will happen organically. But I think sometimes we rush to collaborate with people because they have a good idea and we don't actually know who they are, what their value systems are. And then it falls apart because you didn't actually build in an opportunity to humanize each other. You just went straight for the brand.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience. I think that's so important. It's something we also try to stress to our fellows. Building that community within the community is so important, and finding those like-minded people who share the same passion as you, who also want to make the change in the communities. And it really just starts with the simplistic humanizing people. People want to know that you care, that you care about them as a person first, and not just about what's going on in the community, so that you can, get the story. So I think that's a very we live in a transactional culture here in America. So I think there's always some sort of skepticism when people, when you interact with people and, you're generally interested in hearing their story. But I think it's so necessary, and it's so necessary in work like this as well. And speaking of, connecting with communities, this panel and our cohort of fellows are really a cross-representational group who identify with so many diverse communities, like being people of color, or being a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, or people with different abilities, to name a few. We have so many different types of people within our community. So as journalists who represent marginalized communities, how are you and your organizations ensuring that diverse voices are heard, that they're being engaged, and that they're being included in your storytelling?
Well, I'm on the board of NAHJ, which is the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, the Philly chapter. And that's really baked in our mission, right? Is like more Latinos in news. So part of what we do is we work with newsrooms, we work with media organizations, we work with freelancers and young people, and we just try to get more Latinx people hired, right? That's part of it, is no entry point. And then we also try to provide resources for people who are, starting their own projects and being more entrepreneurial, because I think younger people are starting to realize how hard the entry points are into a traditional newsroom. And so they're like the Brit Harleys out there, we're gonna start our own thing. We're gonna just, be our own boss and create our own media outlet. So we try to encourage that too. But I think during the pandemic, something that we all rallied together along with other Latinx organizations, like community-based organizations, was demanding that information be translated and interpreted into Spanish. Because there was life-saving emergency information coming from city, state, and federal governments that was changing all the time, and people did not have access to that information. There's an assumption that they have Telemundo and Univision, or even radio stations like La Mega, but there's no local news in that, right? And we know in New Jersey, there's a high population of Spanish speakers, but a lot of the news from those networks comes from New York or Philadelphia, right? So we don't have New Jersey news in Spanish. So it becomes very difficult to get that information to the people. So we've advocated in Trenton and we've advocated in Philly, working with local government to demand that the information be put in those languages. And so language access is something that's growing, because now newsrooms realize that Hispanics are the second largest voting bloc, and that we have the highest population of people under the age of 25. And, we're growing as a minority group. And so now they're we want to engage Latinos, right? But just translating your content, or maybe putting one person on staff to represent more than 19 different ethnicities, that's not enough. So part of what we're also trying to do with that Free Press at NAHJ is make people understand that our groups are not monolithic, right? All Black people are not the same, all Asian people. There's a lot of differences, right? Within our cultures and ethnicity, we do have things that tie us together. For Latinos, it's, language. And for a lot of people, it might be the religion and some traditions. But, there's a big difference between Puerto Ricans, right, who make up a lot of the Latinos in New Jersey and Philadelphia, and people who are new immigrants or undocumented immigrants from Central and South America, right? Like the needs are very different, and we can't treat everybody as the same when it comes to like being consumers of information. So I think, again, like we advocate differently, you know, even though we are like part of groups that are marginalized. But I think the thing that we all have in common is like, we demand inclusion, we demand representation. And, you know, like there's a reckoning happening where like our voices aren't going to be silenced anymore, right? Like we're starting to fight back and like reclaim the media space.
Thank you, Vanessa. So you spoke a lot to creating space for people to be able to share their own stories, as well as accessibility. And I think that's a crucial point here in Atlantic City as well. Just within these 48 blocks, there's over 30 languages spoken, and almost 50% of people speak languages other than English. So that's definitely something that we need to consider moving ahead, because like you said, we're sandwiched between these two major markets of Philadelphia and New York. So we don't always have the specific news that our community needs. So thank you for offering that.
Yeah, and I'll jump in really quickly here in Newark through the Newark News and Story Collaborative, a section of that, really a large part of it, through our community media lab. We train residents in storytelling, news gathering, media making, to fill some of the information gaps that we learned about here around COVID-19, food insecurity, rental assistance, utility assistance, and really looking at how we can just have diverse narratives from folks that we know aren't represented in media, but also what community members said that they wanted to see themselves kind of reflected in. And so it's only open for Newark residents because we wanted to create opportunities for residents who were organizers, maybe have some media experience, maybe have a lot of media experience, but to really come together in community to think about ways that how we can work together, but also think about how we can create different types of media. So they receive a stipend. We also work with facilitators here in the city who also receive a stipend, honorarium for whatever sessions it is that they lead. And a lot of the challenges that I experience at a public radio station and even trying to work in partnership with other newsrooms is really what gave me the push to launch 5 Wards Media. Newark is made up of 5 wards, so I wanted to create a space where residents could see themselves reflected. After having conversations with folks for the last 2.5 years, but formerly coming from the education space, and really just seeing a lot of the systemic oppression that our young people face and their families, I just got really clear pivoting into media, what could be possible for us in our communities, just having our own space, having editorial independence to really think about accountability, what types of restorative narrative that we want to create, but also thinking about who is actually creating the pipeline for us, who is actually creating the opportunities for us. And so, you know, just even my experience in the newsroom, my news team was great, but, you know, it's always those different types of politics just in media in general. And so I think here, what we're looking to do is just really reflect our people, have the news look like the folks here beyond the crime beat, because that's a lot of what is represented here. You know, we just see our folks usually in mugshots. Sometimes they may not even be guilty of said crime, and now your name and everything is out there. And so we're also thinking about different ways to kind of counter some of this other media, but also allow folks to see themselves in other spaces, because while there is some coverage locally, there's not a lot. So really just creating a space for us and also creating more opportunities for us as well.
And I'll say for WHYY, there's a number of things that I think we're doing. But first, I just want to say that the best thing that organizations can do, news organizations, when they want to ensure diverse voices, is hire the right people in those key positions, right? I think for Brit and Vanessa, those organizations that they work for, they were the right people. I think I'm the right person for WHYY. People who know me prior to WHYY often say, do they know who you are? Like, do they know what they're getting when you joined? And I was like, if they didn't, they damn sure know now. They're very aware. Because I think when you go into these spaces that have been traditionally predominantly white institutions that predominantly have not centered community voices, who looked at expertise only in the context of academic attainment and not lived experience, they maybe if not intentionally, they create a culture of exclusion, right? And so with the same level of rigor and intention that they created this level of exclusivity and elitism, you have to use that same level of intention to counteract it, to autocorrect it. So, part of what I do is I'm part of the editor cohort, right? So I'm on the calls every morning as we're going through story pitches, as we're thinking about long form stories. And they're talking about, well, let's do this. And I'm thinking, well, this is who we need to call for that story. Let me look at that copy before it gets published. These are the people that we need to be reaching out to. Have you thought to this person, right? Connecting them, our newsroom with sources. To that end, we're actually building a source database called A Guide to the Grassroots. That was almost akin to NPR's Source of the Week, but it'll be a tool that will start out with allowing just our journalists and editors, but eventually, the region's journalists and editors to be able to tap into the grassroots sources in our area who can speak to issues of the same way that, they run and try to find someone with letters behind their name that can speak to an issue of whatever. We also want to be able to say, well, there's a whole group of people with lived experience who live very close to this problem, who also should be at the table helping and inform those solutions. So that's one of the things that we're doing. Another thing that we're doing that we've been getting a lot of attention on is our News and Information Community Exchange, or NICE. It's a grassroots journalism collaborative, mutual aid journalism collaborative, populated by journalism grassroots creators, right? Like if I wasn't at WHYY, I probably would have been a part of NICE, especially back in the day. And it comes from acknowledging that communities aren't just consumers of news and information, but producers of it too. And when we acknowledge that communities, there's no such thing as the voice of the voiceless. People have a voice, you just don't listen, right? And so when you acknowledge that communities are also telling their stories, and communities have traditionally told their own stories, right? Because they've had to deal with news deserts, they've had to deal with exclusion, they've had to deal with predominantly white newsrooms saying that's not a story, or what's the angle, and they have to jump over hurdles to get their stories told, right? So I think that, with our source database, with going and tapping into the grassroots, all of it in the through line is acknowledging that, hey, our audiences can also be our collaborators. And it may seem like a novel thing, but it's just like, why wouldn't we want to collaborate with the people who are closest to these issues? Why should we think about doing it on our own? Newsrooms all the time talk about, we're stretched thin, we can't create a pipeline to diverse talent. And so you have to be intentional about creating this talent and realize the talent isn't always going to come through traditional pipelines like J School, the Klein School for Media and Communications, Columbia University. Sometimes it's going to come from 31st and Tasker. That's a Philly reference, but sometimes it's going to come from the neighborhoods, right? It's going to come from the people in the protest. People have the power to create media now. Media has never been so democratized. Unfortunately, people are also irresponsible with that, right? With everybody being a publisher, there's a lot more misinformation, but that's where we step in. That's when we start grooming and coaching and telling people, these is produce media, as we say at WHYY, commit acts of journalism, but here's how you do it responsibly. So our mantra is, our audience can also be our collaborators. We want people to commit acts of journalism, and that communities aren't just consumers of news and information and producers of it too. And we remind ourselves of that every day. They're not our competition, they're our comrades.
Thank you. I love how you and Brit both talked about really involving community members in the process, not just in the product, but involving them in the process to creating this content and giving them the necessary tools to be able to do so accurately. And that's something we also stress here at Stories of AC. And I loved how you said that people don't have a voice. I mean, it's not that people don't have the voice. That's one of the things that really drives me crazy as well. People have a voice. So we often say we like to pass the microphone and give them the opportunity to share that voice. So speaking of the type of people you want to work with, the type of community members you want to work with, if you were building a dream team of people to work alongside with you as you continue to pioneer this work, what are some of the qualities that you would look for, some of the traits that you would look for? What's your ideal group project members? What do they look like?
Well, we have a pretty good collaborative in New Jersey going. It's called the New Jersey Community Media Collaborative, which we are all a part of. And so that's Stories of AC, Brit, and 5 Words Media. We also have the Trenton Journal, and we have the Bloomfield Information Project, hopefully be growing our members. But I think, again, like when you look at our group, you know, it's a value system that I think joins us together, right? We come from different backgrounds, we're representing different parts of the state, but I think ultimately we all really care about our community and we care about people. And like right now, a lot of people are doing a lot with a little bit of resources, right? And so that tells you a lot. There was a period of time I was not a paid journalist. You know, I was bartending, I was doing event planning. I had like 4 jobs. I was a gig worker, and it wasn't that long ago. But I still was like creating media content and documenting and like, you know what I mean? And that's what I look for, right? Like, would you do this even though you weren't paid to do so? Or do you love it that much? Would you engage in community service and organize and, you know, step up, volunteer, give service if it wasn't your job to do so? And I feel like everybody in our group, like the answer is yes, right? Like we're gonna do it regardless. We're gonna find the way, right? Like money is an obstacle, but it's not gonna stop us from achieving our goals. And so, and I think, you know, in full disclosure, like I'm anti-capitalist. Like I don't feel that commercial media is actually serving the public interest right now. I do feel like people who are motivated by things that aren't rooted in profit and exploitation, right, are the kind of people that I want to be around. So again, it's more like values than like personal characteristics, because if we're on the same page that like we actually care about human rights and we care about other people, then like all the rest will follow. But I do think a really important thing is the desire to collaborate, right? Like, and to share ideas and not to like hoard resources and hoard ideas. Because I think J school, I did go to J school. I went, you know, for several levels of education, and it makes you competitive. Like I think academia like often grooms people to compete and to keep your ideas to yourself, and like this the whole idea of like intellectual property. And I'm more of the camp of like open source information and making education and information accessible. And like by working together and building power, we become stronger, right? Like competing is actually not something that's conducive to community building. And so that's what I look for. Like, do people want to build together? Do people want to share? Do we want to each bring something to the table and like contribute, right? That's the kind of people that I want to look for. And people that are also like not married to the idea of traditional journalism and like objectivity, right? Like right now, there is a group of people across the country that we're just smashing down these like traditional structures of journalism. And we're like in the like, you know, break it down and build it back up, right, mode. So you have to really be open-minded. You have to be brave. And you also have to be like a visionary, right? You have to see this vision of what could be possible. You have to see the other world. And it requires like imagination. And that's why Afrofuturism is like so important to all of this, right? Like in order to build this future, we have to see it, we have to believe it, and we have to be able to let go of the past. And so I just love that we're all working together in New Jersey, because I feel like we do have a shared vision for what's possible. And that's very motivating and exciting.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I know you talked about just people that are like-minded and having the passion, but also people that know how to work collaboratively. And I think there are some personality traits that kind of fall under that, right? In order to work collaboratively, you have to be someone that's kind of flexible or adaptable, right? So I do want to give Chris and Brit a few moments to chime in on that too. I know we're running towards the end of our event today, and I want to leave some time for questions and answers. But Chris or Brit, are there any qualities or traits that you want to add to that?
Just real quick, one that I'll throw in that's just like in the front of my brain is integrity. I want somebody that's going to hold me accountable and hold themselves accountable, and hold other people accountable. I think that is really important, and it's just like, again, with the aligned values, and it's like, what's your politic, you know? Just want to uplift something that Chris said earlier, and thinking about like how you connect and like why you have to have those shared values. If you're partnering and things fall apart, you can like easily avoid like not having the right team members or collaborators if you're really, really clear on the shared values, on the shared mission, on the shared vision, but also just like, are we in this space together to like hold each other accountable? If we're talking about equity, what does that mean? And other folks have like different definitions of some things, right? And so where is that alignment, that synergy, often that could bring us together? But I think integrity is super important, and how we do the work, how we engage, you know, especially being at capacity. I'm just one person still trying to find a team. And so I want somebody to be able to also fill in the gaps and hold that line for myself, but also in how we show up in the work, how we do the work. If we have a particular purpose of being, like whatever our North Star is, you know, just staying on track and really with the mission, no matter the program, the partnership, or the collaboration.
And I'll just add quickly, integrity is important. I think for me, the top of the list is humility, and realizing that this isn't about us. This is about the people we're doing it for, the communities we're doing it for. This is about justice, creativity, courageousness, and imaginative. I always say, you know, you gotta be able to imagine anything that you want and go after it. The impossible is a matter of opinion, and the sky is not the limit, it's the starting point.
Love that, imaginative. That's a great one, because we really are reimagining what the news media looks like, right? I have one more question. I think it's important, so we could just do a lightning round of it, but considering that we're bringing in community members to essentially report on their own communities, and people are coming from different backgrounds, from different work histories and careers, but they're also really passionate about their communities, and some people are really passionate about certain things that happen within the community. So what are some tips that you can offer as they make this transition from community member to community reporter, on how to address issues that may be close to them as a reporter? So for example, if there's someone that is a parent of a child that attends a school in the community, and maybe they are somewhat disgruntled, you know, they have some issues with the school system, but they also want to be an objective reporter and share information that's accurate and that's essential for their community to know. What are some tips you can offer them, again, as they evolve to become these community reporters, on how to detach a bit from their own opinions and their own biases, perhaps, to be able to still share accurate news on something that's close to them?
I'll just say quickly that I think the best journalists are those who pursue the stories that matter most to them, right? And I think that you don't have to be objective to be accurate, you know. And so I think objectivity is a myth, you know, for the most part. I don't think I think sometimes objectivity can lead to misinformation, and it's a completely different conversation. But I think when you're so intentional about trying to give people both sides of the story, even when one side doesn't make any sense or is incredibly inflammatory or incredibly inaccurate, objectivity says that that person still deserves the microphone. I think that you have to pursue the stories that matter most to you, but also hold yourself accountable that you're not necessarily just venting in the press, but that you're actually trying to solve a problem. And I think you're going to solve the problem that you care about the most. So I would say, you know, pursue those beats and the stories that matter most to you, but also hold yourself responsible. Make sure that you're being factual. Have you know, find a peer that can peer review your stuff if you don't have an editor, and find somebody who's always going to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I co-sign all of that. I also believe that I don't know that objectivity is like a myth, but it's certainly like a Western corporate media capitalist journalist ethic that is not subscribed to in other parts of the world. Like when I was doing research on Bosnia and Croatia with journalists who had like covered the Yugoslavian war, they did not ascribe to this like being neutral and like abandoning yourself. Like when you experience a civil war and you see the deaths of your like you cannot be objective. And so as they were explaining this to me, I thought of my own traumas and experiences that affect my worldview. And they said, like, you know, one guy said, there is the truth and there is not the truth. As long as you are telling the truth and you can prove that it's the truth, like that's what guides us as journalists. Like we are here to tell the people the truth, and it's going to come from my eyes. And so I found that to be like very impactful as an American, right? Because we have a very ethnocentric view of what media should be, right? Like we don't look at journalism and communications in a global perspective. And the second thing is like when I was at Philly Cam running the community radio station, the thing that I observed most frequently from our community producers is that they didn't go beyond their networks. And I'm like, hey, I see you're bringing your friend back on as a guest for the second time on your show. Are there any other people you can talk to? And so I would challenge community reporters to go outside your immediate network because you're going to exhaust that pretty fast, right? You are going to have to cold call people. You are going to have to call around and make source lists. And you are going to have to approach people in high positions, right? And you're going to have to ask them the tough questions. So I feel like that was more so the problem than anything else, is that people tended to gravitate to who was familiar to them and who they felt comfortable with and who they were already trusted by. And so the challenge is to develop those relationships and grow your network with people that you don't know. It means you have to work harder, right? Like it means that you have to work to get them to trust you. And then the other thing that I would advocate that they do is like, just be transparent about who you are. Like, and if you do have something in, you know, about yourself or the story, right, like that you're connected to, be transparent about that in the storytelling, or at the very least be transparent about that when you are engaging people and like telling them who you are, right? So, you know, just like, what's your experience with that issue? Like, you know, when I would talk to people who were firmly incarcerated, you know, I would say, well, my father was firmly incarcerated. Like I grew up with a parent in prison. So like, I understand, that's my connection. That's my empathy. So I think that, that transparency about who, like, we're not robots, like we're real people with experiences. And if anything, being transparent about who you are and like if you do have this connection, like brings you closer to people, especially people who have dealt with trauma. I think it's very, very important to do that. And then lastly, I'll just say that like verification is very, very important. Doing your due diligence. And unfortunately, people do lie, or they misremember, or they, you know, they don't give you all the information. And so it's really critical that we fact check people, we corroborate information, we do deep research, we use data-based evidence to support what it is that they're saying. I feel like that's what's missing in a lot of like social media, a lot of blog posts, you know, people that are creating content. They're just sort of saying things, right? They're not qualifying it. And so just because you're a citizen journalist, just because we're not, you know, objective, like that doesn't mean that that gives us a free pass to not do that other work. That is the work of the journalists.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I see Brit said that you and Chris covered it all. So I think you offered some really great advice for our community reporters. So now that we have a few moments left, we have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to open the floor up to all of our participants today. If you have any questions for our panelists. So you can feel free to unmute yourself. You can add a question in the chat and we can ask it for you, whatever you prefer.
A thought came to me when everyone was speaking. And, you know, aside from the obvious, My name is Michelle. I'm one of the fellows. If our three panelists could give some insight, I was thinking, why isn't the establishment pouring a bunch of money into this kind of reporting? Because my thought came, I'm in the LGBT community, and absolute different brands are thinking like, hey, this is a community that we should pour money into, and they put rainbows on everything. And I understand that that's pandering, but I mean, I just think there's a need for this and people are hungry for this. And I don't know why the connection isn't being made to pour money into a Hispanic news channel, right in major cities or something. I hope that was clear. I kind of had trouble asking it, but I think you know what I mean. I just don't understand the disconnect. I think there's money to be made. There's advertising dollars to earn. There's these niche markets that are very loyal. So why aren't you guys millionaires, the three of you?
Oh, well, I mean, I could. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think, Michelle, like for me in my lived experience as a Black queer woman, I live on a lot of different intersections. So that question is also loaded as to like why I'm not a millionaire right now. However, that also just speaks to like systems and oppression and power. We talked a lot about just like how things systemically in this country, media is not separate from these other industries, where reckonings are happening. Money is flowing all the time, but we often know that money doesn't touch our communities. And when I say that, I mean Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, immigrants, poor folks, you know what I'm saying? So there won't be much investment in media for those specific things, for like these cable, commercial stations that are already exist, which is why folks like me are just doing our own thing. So instead of being left out of the conversation, we have to be talking about how can we create something that is for us, authentic. We really committed to the community and into our values. How do we have this be an invitation for community to build with us? And just kind of go from there, because all money also ain't good money. So I won't be taking money from everybody or wanting to be beholden to some particular things, which is also something to consider in, this process. But just wanted to throw that in there. I hope I answered your question, but I think it's also layered when you think about just like systemic oppression and all of the other things that just money don't flow in a lot of places for those reasons.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly that the good news is we advocated in New Jersey for the Civic Information Bill, which was passed, that ultimately created the consortium that's now funded by New Jersey tax dollars. So now we have $1 million allocated this year for local journalism projects. Like this project from Stories of Atlantic City receives funding from that consortium to bring community reporters. So it has taken a lot of organizing and advocacy to reclaim that money, right? To liberate the funds. And the good news is that we at Free Press are taking that to the federal level, and we're now organizing for federal legislation to publicly fund local journalism. We've also been working, Christina and I and Brit have been part of this statewide coalition with foundations and funders to, again, drive this point on we need to fund Black and Brown journalists outlets, and we need to build new things. So it is happening. Why is it like this? Well, because the FCC in Congress has made harmful laws and policies which allowed corporate media to own mostly everything, right? So there's policies that create the conditions that exist now, right, for like the loss of local journalism and why we don't have access as people of color and all the other minority groups. We're trying to undo those policies, right? Like now we have a new administration, we have new FCC commissioners in place that are sympathetic, but it requires a lot of advocacy and organizing. So we are working on it.
Yes.
You go to freepress.net to see like the political ways in which we try to make these changes. But hopefully, and that's the power in our New Jersey Community Media Collaborative. We don't want $1 million. We want $100 million.
We want it all. We want it all. I'm going to jump in here, Vanessa.
Thank you.
We can literally talk about this for a whole other hour. But I did want to give you all a chance to share your information. I'm sorry if there were more questions in the chat. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But to our panelists, would you mind just dropping your information in the chat or dropping your social media handles here on screen so that our fellows, our community members who are still really interested in this work can reach out to you further after this event? I see people dropping some information at Brit Harley, Brit at newarkstories.com. You can also feel free to unmute yourself and drop your social media handles if that's easier. All right, they have dropped all their information in the chat. Wonderful, wonderful. Make sure you copy paste. So thank you all again for joining us today. I really wish we had more time because this is such a great dialogue, and I love this group of people here. So we'll have to do this again at some point, but thank you to our panelists again for taking this time to share with us here in Atlantic City. And thank you for all of our participants who joined today. I hope you were able to take something away from this event. And hopefully we will all be in contact soon. Again, make sure you copy paste all the information in the chat so that you can reach out and continue to network with the people, the change makers that are doing this work. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks,
Thanks,
Toby.
Brit.
Thanks, guys, for having me. Happy holidays.
Same
Yes,
to you.
happy holidays, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. This was awesome. I'm going to stop recording. This was so great.